Hello everyone, and welcome to Modern Mondays, an evening with Hwan Kim. We are thrilled to premiere in the States his film Hair is a Piece of Head. My name is Anna Janevsky. I'm a curator at the Media and Performance Department here at MoMA. And before we start our conversation with Hwan, I would like to thank our colleagues from the film department, our AV team, and the team from the virtual cinema. So before also jumping really into a conversation with Hwan Kim, I would like also to remind you that his piece, Temper Clay, which is in a MoMA collection, will be shown at the Kravis Studio as an expanded installation version. It's really a beautiful film about family dynamics in the contemporary Korean society, told by a different generational and class angles. And so if you're in New York, please come to the Kravis Studio from June 5th to July 18th. And just a few words to introduce Hwan Kim before we start talking about his latest film that you could see on our virtual cinema. So Hwan Kim has a BA in mathematics from Williamstone and also Masters of Science in Visual Studies at MIT. He studied in Amsterdam in the prestigious Rijksacademie, and he's mainly based in New York, although recently he's been spending more time in Hawaii. In the last two decades since he's active, he's been producing multimedia installations and performances that merge really the mythological and the everyday. And through his very distinctive method of intertwining video, music, storytelling, and sculpture within the exhibition space, he also developed a very unique narrative approach to migration, immigration, translation, and regeneration. He participated in the 57th Venice Biennial and is going to have a solo show at MoMA very soon, but also at the DA Gallery in Berlin, Art Sonja Center in Seoul, the Tanks at Tate Modern in London, Kunsthalle Basel, Queen's Museum, and Haus der Kunst in Munich, among many others. He works very closely with the musicians David Michael de Gregorio, and they even created an opera together. His works are at the collection at MoMA, at Tate Modern, and the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Korea. His most recent publication is exactly about the film that we're going to talk tonight, Hair is a Piece of Head. And also we want to congratulate him because he got the Guggenheim Fellowship this year, and his future exhibition is exactly in Hawaii and the Hawaii Triennial next year. So Hair is a Piece of Head. So as I said, the film that you had the opportunity to see in the two following weeks on our virtual cinema is part song of your ongoing project, A Record of Drifting Across the Sea. And you started this project in 2017 as an exploration of the Korean immigration to the United States in the beginning of the 20th century. So can you tell more about this ongoing project? How did you start? What was the trigger? What is your research? And also I would like to mention that a lot of your research about this project is also available on your website, and we can talk more about that very soon.
Well, in Venice, I showed Love Before Bond. And a lot of the text in Love Before Bond was from James Baldwin text. So when I start a project, it's not...
This is your film from 2017.
2017 that I showed in Venice Biennale. And I work with Samurai Coates, who is the main character of the book Tanahashi Coates, his father wrote. And I didn't approach him, or I didn't think about working with that text or anything. It's really not about Tanahashi Coates' text either. Mainly, I was reading a lot about the writings by James Baldwin. And when I start a film or when I start a project, it's not particular to one text and translating that into a film. Part of it is my learning about that culture and literature. And I knew that I wanted to learn more about the African American literature and the history of it, because I know very little of it, because I'm not from here, first of all. And I was seeing my niece growing up, and she was born in 2000, and I was seeing her her as a person who was being raised by my sister, who I know very well. But I don't know what it means for her to grow up in this country, because I came in a very different route. So I was very curious about what it means to be an Asian American woman in New York City, and to be raised by these people in a current climate that we have. So I was sort of learning with her, curious about what she's reading, what I haven't read, what she hasn't read. I was very taken by James Baldwin's literature and his way of writing and what he meant. And one of the very interesting quote by him to me that he said to many other people is that he thought he was black when he was living in the US for a long time, but when he went to Paris, he realized that he was an American person. That duality really interested me, and that's something that I know what it means also, having lived in different places. That started to also started me to be more and more interested about the history of Asian American. I'm not an Asian American person, but
as you said, you are like a green card holder.
I'm a green card holder, yeah. Which has a very deep history also in what it means for people to come into a country, to get stamped, and to have some kind of who gets to come into the country. That is the starting of the immigration, and that is the starting also of the shutting people out of the immigration, right? So that history I didn't really know so much about, and we only know certain people's history around that, and not so much about the Asian American, and definitely not so much of the Korean American history. And in order to also understand the contemporary history and what is going on North and South in China and Korea relationship, Japan and Korea relationship, we only know from the education we got from earlier period of our life. And I think that goes along with, that goes with many different people in different educational systems. They're very influenced by their primal education. And the education you get from the atmosphere, by living in one place for a long time. And as I'm looking into this, I was seeing, I knew that there's some kind of connection between the 19th century and 20th century and the colonization and all leading up to my niece being here, for example. But I wanted to know more in detail by doing some granular research. And that led me to look into the Asian American immigration, and in particular, Korean American immigration between the 1880s to 1910. And these are the first people who are leaving the country. And a lot of these people's traces hard to find because they leave the country that used to be called Joseon Dynasty. Mm-hmm. And then that dynasty goes away because it becomes Japanese colonization period between 1910 and 1945. So if you have left the country during this period, you lose the country, and then when in 1945 to 1948, when Republic of Korea is born, that's no longer the country that they used to know. It's a totally different ideology, idea about gender, class, everything. So I was interested in these people's life and who takes care of their history. Is there a record? Who takes interest in their history from their side? So that I use that sort of as a metaphor, like that kind of movement and that kind of relationship between people and the land. And I started to see different works in literature, poetry, or film that relates to these production of culture that has no agency.
And I think in that sense, maybe we can talk also a little bit about the title of the film, "The Hair is a Piece of Head," which is a quote from a Korean politician, general, and philosopher from the end of the 19th century who was also into Confucius. You told me, and I think if you can say the entire quote and the reason why you choose that quote, I think it illustrates also well what you just said.
Ooh, no, I can't. I have to read the quote to say it, but I can just.
I would rather cut my head off than.
But it starts before that. Yeah. Well, I can just say that it's one of the Choi Kyun is a writer, not writer. Choi Kyun is a scholar and a politician, which goes together usually in the Confucius society, such as Joseon Dynasty, and at the end of it, there are a lot of potential colonizers coming to Korea with their interest in Asia in general. So they're looking for the port in general, as we know with. Shanghai and what happened in China, and there's also Japan, but Korea became this peninsula that they took interest in. So there's like Russia, there's China, there's Japan, there's United States, there's French, and when all these people are coming in, naturally there's a nationalism that is that is very strong from the Joseon Dynasty point of view. So he's one of those people, and he said to the order that was made after the revolution in Korea that all men should cut their hair to modernize themselves, because it was taken as a symbol of the old idea. He said, I can cut my head, but I cannot cut my hair. And this incident is a very famous incident that people from the left and right use for their own purpose to show their allegiance to the history that tries to protect their country, patriotism. But that quote is not really a Korean saying. That is written by Confucius, and is part of the Chinese history. And so there's a complexity between what we know as what we, meaning Korean people, know as theirs, and whether that what they know as theirs is theirs, right? So that is the beginning of the quote, and it's also like we're just jokingly talking about it, like the fact that like what is it? Logically, it doesn't really make sense either, because because the reason why is that it's the Confucius idea is that all your body, hair, and everything is given by your parents. How can you cut it? But how can you cut your head? Because that's also given by your parents. And then there's another thing about how like where to locate the border. Is my hand, or is it part of the arm, or hair and head? And this kind of like very basic distinguishing that you have to do, as in Alexander's technique. Where does your body or hair start? Where does your shoulder start? This is all about the border.
Yeah, and somatic borders in a way. Yeah.
So that's something that I was interested in. Where's the border of our concept? Where's the border of our screen? What's the border of our film, and the ideas in general? Yeah.
And you're as you often do in your films, you are like narrating a story, but there's a very specific way that the story is unfold. So the Hair is a Piece of Head, it is about Korean immigration and the end of the 19th and beginning of 20th century, first to Hawaii and then to the United States. But you're not giving some kind of a linear or like documentary narration. What you're doing is like more some kind of a visual collage, I would say, and you're also intertwining Chinese history, Hawaiian history, and Japanese history. So you're like, the Korean immigration story, it's like opening up many of other histories, and maybe also many ways of like how do we intend Asian American, more of like something that is more homogeneous in a way, like Chinese, or this kind of a stereotypes. So I would like if you could talk a little bit how this story exactly opened this. You already mentioned that, but in the film you are talking about the differences between Chinese and Japanese, the reaction and encounter of the Hawaiian and the Korean. So if you can say a little bit more how those like other threads open while you were doing your research, and particularly while you were filming the work in Hawaii.
So I think it's very easy to, like, when you grow up and when you feel like the past is past and something that one should be able to understand, you can simplify the past. We want to say that anti-Asian violence right now that is happening right now is something that is new, but it's not true. It's been going on for a long time in many different formations, and then even the different solution has come out and have worked and sometimes not worked, and then after a while it goes into a state where people don't remember that anymore, and then things happen again, right? So when I went to Korea, when I went to Hawaii to make this film, of course you have some kind of information about the history of Hawaii and also the Korean people who went there and the labor movement that was there and the relation between the Hawaii and the United States. But you start to meet people who've been living there for a long time, and they have a very different perspective from the perspectives that you've been reading. And I found that to be a very interesting experience in what is so-called research, what is before a pre-production period of making things. And that's very important because I meet people who I want to work with there, and they have a different perspective on the things that I know about. For example, when Hawaii land for a lot of Korean people who came in between 1903 to 1905, 6. They think of that land as a U.S. land, American land. But from the Hawaiian perspective, it's not an American land. For a lot of people, it's still not an American land. When, from the Korean perspective, even if you say the word U.S. soil, it's not the Korean. Well, the part that, let me just start this over again. The part that when in 1945 in the Life magazine, there's an article that said, of course, the U.S. is antagonizing Japan at the same time, so they're calling Japanese attack on U.S. soil in 1941. This is a very complex sentence, a complex quote, because Korean people or other people who know the World War II very well would just take it for granted that, oh, of course, Hawaii, as we know, is a U.S. territory, and then Japanese people attacked it. From Hawaiian point of view, if you read this, there's something already wrong. What they attack is not a U.S. soil, it is a Hawaiian soil. For Korean people who are reading that text, they're thinking about the aggression the Japanese people are doing, the way that Japanese people colonize Korea, because that has been their education. So depending on what your prior existing knowledge is, that sentence could pan out in so many different ways. And that comes back to when you're talking about the collage, is that sometimes before you start to want to end the sentence or end the essay or the film, the complexity makes you pause. And that pause is a various perspective that happens in a stillness. You are going towards something in time, but you have to create this pause space. And I think a lot of poetry does that too, but I think that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, and when you talk about pose, and we can go back to the content, but just it's interesting because you added the film and using the first time the iPhone live photos feature, which is somehow like stopping those moments, like being more focused on certain moments that then you can edit later. Was this part of the thinking? Like, what was the reason that you used this feature for this film?
Well, that's something that I found interesting in relation to what I'm talking about. But the real reason is that COVID happened. So I was going to the sites, I was meeting a lot of people, but I didn't want to start the film until I was certain about the direction. If there's a pause space, there's an atmosphere. There's some kind of a the weight of that the space. What is the balance between the weight and the lightness? So that's something that I wanted to have it in my mind before making the film. So I was just doing research with photos. Right, and then the COVID happened. So around the time when I was just about to start, so I couldn't propose, I couldn't work with people, I couldn't buy the things, all that. So I decided that maybe because all the photos that I've taken is a live photo feature was there, so there's a movement in it, which is about it's not really the bracketing as we know. It's not just about the aperture bracketing or the focus. There's a movement in between taking the picture and after taking the picture, and the light difference is recorded there. And the sound is sometimes recorded there too. So I wanted to, I thought of that sort of as a moment where people don't recognize. And also it doesn't get documented because we see usually the movement that has a goal. As I said, it's not a space that is in a pause or in a loop. So I like that unit that is longer than a pause, but shorter than a meaning. Mm-hmm. And so that is what I worked with. But also I was interested in, because whenever you want to find any kind of documents about these people is what he said, what she said, he said, she said. So it's about your ancestors, document little stories that you remember. And then after that, what you know is the landscape and the climate, something that is a little bit persisting. But the real thing that what you see is little pictures of the family. So those pictures has nothing to do with the story of the immigration. Those are just family pictures that you took next to the trees posing, or some kind of, in a way, like if you think of it as some people that you're not invited to, they're not particularly interesting pictures. But I was finding it interesting that those are the only things that are left. And they give you with great joy, you see them because they become physical. Or people look like this, people wore this, people did their hair like this. So it makes the stories that you're reading about concrete. So I was interested in that relation between the banality of the photos and then the stories that I was reading.
And also, in talking what you said earlier about like the moments, the memories, the ancestors. There is something also interesting apart the way, as I said, there's like organizing the film as a visual collage of different photos, but like shots, performers with masks, makeup, and we can talk about that later. But then there is a part that you did also in your previous work with subtitles and also using 4 different languages. And sometimes the same event or the same thought is narrated in 2 different languages. So you're using the Korean, Japanese, Hawaiian, and English. How was the choice of the language something that you thought from the beginning, or it just came more natural while you were like working with the film and working with the material? And also the roles of the subtitles. There's something interesting about the way you're using subtitles.
Yeah, so I think I just talked about this Life magazine quotation about what is Japanese attack on U.S. soil, and how that phrase can be interpreted with different connotation, and sometimes not even connotation, but different meanings to different people, and it has to do with the language group. Because I think in Hawaii, in the Hawaiian, like Olelo Hawaii, the Hawaiian language, is not spoken by so many people because there was a systemic effort to delete that language from the culture. But now there's a vitalization of that language, and a lot of people, the more and more people are starting to speak that language. But if the language didn't exist, of course one can say that with English, I can talk about the Hawaiian sovereignty or the Hawaiian perspective, but there is a little bit of a strangeness, and that is what is also happening right now in the African American ways of thinking about their ancestry or the reason why one is here, right? Because you are here, but you are against, but also with the belief of belonging here. So I think Hawaiian language to me was very interesting because it didn't die, and how those people knew where they're from because their history describes the landscape where they're still living. But the thing is that not many people speak it. But if you go into that language, there's a perspective with which they can see the world again. So I find it's kind of a magical space. Once you enter it, you have a totally different worldview. So that was to me interesting. And when you don't know the language, there's a discomfort from the people who think that they know about this soil, they know about this attack, they know about this history, but you start to hear this foreign language that you don't understand, and they're speaking about it. So it leaves room of doubt into your own knowledge, right, and whatever that you're speaking. So that to me was interesting, to tell the story again and again in different languages. It's in a way a strategy that's been used by Rashomon very famously. So that was interesting to me.
And how, because you've been living, I mean, you're in New York now, but you spent 1.5 years in Hawaii. And when you had the idea of the film, did you know that you're going to film it in Hawaii? And how much the time that you're spending there, how much that, and all the knowledge that you acquired also in the book that I mentioned, it is hair is a piece of head, because also to mention that the film that we had the opportunity to see has been commissioned by the Gwangju Biennial. And so how much like the fact of being in Hawaii influenced the development of the film? And what I wanted to say, it's also the interview that you have in the book with one of the curators of the Hawaii Biennial, and who is also teaching about Hawaiian art history. So how much, because I guess this was also something new that you discovered, and how much that it really influenced your way of thinking about the film and then telling the story?
So, by the way, it's now not a, it was used to be called Honolulu Biennale, but now I think it's called Hawaii Triennial.
Triennial, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also like a meaning behind that, but I'm not going to go into that. But I think, so there's I think this is something that I think a lot of artists nowadays have to think about and have been thinking about more than before, is when you get, well, so before the cultural product, there's always money because you have to live, but also you have to have the money to spend, to hire people. And then you think about that, where the money is coming from. There's a transparency issue. And then you make the product and you wonder, I mean, a lot of times, especially when the budget becomes bigger and bigger, you don't show it once. So depending on where you show, you think about these people who are seeing it and how does it relate to those people, right? So in this case, the funding came from the Gwangju Biennale, and then I am making a film. I'm not Hawaiian, also I'm not an American, but I am making this film in Hawaii with the people who've been living there for a long time, using all of the landscape, trees, weather, language, everything is, if one can own anything, it's theirs, right? And then, so it was important for me when Drew Broderick, Kauaina Broderick, invited me to the exhibition to show back to the people who I work with and other people who don't know about this cultural product at all. It interests me because where we are, this story itself is about migration, not only in the sense that we know, but it's about things that are floating from one place to another. And a lot of times when some object comes to you, some floating object comes to you, it's an outsider. But if you trace that floating, it's all connected. An island is connected to the continent. And the language is often connected too, also sometimes by juxtaposition. By being together, you become one. Right now in Hawaii, the majority of the ethnicity, demographic is Asian people. It's the majority of the people. So, so that knowing that dynamic is, and that kind of knowing that dynamic also makes you very conscious and careful when you're making decisions, right? So in that way, yes, I'm sure there are so many ways that I was influenced by that concept that you're talking about, but in that way, it did influence me.
And you know the way that the film is structured, it is similar to your previous way of working, but it has also something new in particular with the live photos feature. But there's only if one archive footage of a Hawaiian family talking in Hawaiian, but the other, it's really what you filmed there. And there's a lot of use of masks and makeup and like dressing. And if you can say, like in your dog film or like other works, you're often working like that. So if you can talk more about that, how do you work with the performers, which are almost for the most part in your films, they're not like professional actor, they're your friends or your collaborators. And how do you work with them? And what is the idea? What is the mask represents for you? The making up, the putting another layer.
Mm. Well, so mask is such a big, what it means to me, like it means so many things that it means to other people too, I think. There's nothing new about that. I think with the makeup in particular, I knew that I was interested in drawing quality of the film, of any film, like where, by the layering or the texture of it, the body is used, but body sometimes becomes an image, and that's what photography and camera does anyway. But you can also have added layer of that. So that's something that I was interested in, and another thing is already there's a strangeness in dealing with this topic. It's a very difficult topic to deal with. When you talk about ethnicity, gender, like a lot of topic involved in this research has to do with because a lot of people also, a lot of women come to Hawaii as a picture bride. A lot of women come to the U.S. as picture bride. Women in the United States between late 19th century to early 20th century are often seen as lewd women, you know, or they're prostitutes, or people see it that way because a lot of the laborers were men, and only few women were invited for that reason. So whenever you're dealing with this topic, especially if you're not I'm a man and I'm not a woman, or I'm not Hawaiian, I'm an Asian person, I'm not an American, but I'm talking with American history, who owns that image, who owns that body becomes an issue. And makeup was something that interests me. There are ways to use makeup that becomes a drawing that is not fully identifiable yet. And that part interests me when, like a lot of the, I mean, there's no real people, or there are no actors in this film acting to be those people. As I said, banal photography interests me, so they're basically standing with what is not even correctly Korean costume all the time. It's just the idea. I want to sometimes use wrong knowledge, incorrect knowledge, to enter to the subject that I want to talk about. Which is different from whether their costume was correct, or whether this woman was the same age, or they're in the same house that I'm talking about in the text, or anything like this. So in that way, I was interested in makeup, yeah. And I also wanted to learn about makeup, yeah. So that was another reason, yeah.
And at the end of the film, the date of May 18, 1980 is mentioned as an important historical moment in Korea, in Gwangju, as a moment of a massacre in Gwangju. And it feels some kind of little bit of what you were talking earlier, the fact, you know, of being commissioned somewhere, doing something somewhere else, but like being able to connect the dots of how things are always somehow influencing each other. But it feels like almost some kind of displacement, a little bit of something that happened in Gwangju to Hawaii. And it also, I mean, I had the impression, I watched the film several times, that it's almost like opening a new chapter, something that is about to come. So can you talk more about this end and this like historical moment and how you contextualize it within this film?
I like metaphors, like metaphor meaning like when you're talking about one thing, you travel to another place, and then you start to understand, even though you are looking at something else, you start to understand this better by talking about the other thing. So sometimes with historical event too, you wonder if metaphor can exist. You know, people right now there are a lot of things going on right now in Colombia, Myanmar. In different places we read it all the time. Yeah, Palestine. Yeah, so but even in the U.S., you know, you don't have to just around here. There are things going on, but you also have historical knowledge of what has happened before to different people, and there's an alliance that has been made, but sometimes it's not correctly similar or in the same context. So metaphor is interesting because it's not saying that it's the same thing. And clearly, if I say your eyes look like the lake, your eyes are not the lake. So there's no point saying the lake is not the eyes. So with historical event too, one can think about that because and it happens in real strategies by the politician or historians or the military as well. For example, in Hawaii, one of the island was used as a test target site by the U.S. military during many wars, including the Korean War. So literally in this case, a land is used as if it's a Korean land, in this case, North Korean land, and that they bombed that very land. So a real space that has trees and animals and has a historical importance becomes just a metaphor. This is not a metaphor. I'm stretching it, but it's like that kind of relationship. So that is something that I thought about making a film, where even though you're thinking about one thing, you are making another story in order for you to really think about this part. Because sometimes we get soaked up in the rhetorics around that one subject that it's very difficult to talk about the blind spot. And once you do, it sometimes it's so politically charged, it becomes problematized. So metaphor is a very interesting way, in film and poetry at least, to think about something that is real around us, I think.
And what about the material that is available on your website? There is like it's really a fascinating material. There are a lot of like photos and information and archive material, and again, it's not it's not like, oh, I'm sharing my academic research. It's more like there are a lot of, it looks like more, when you're filming something and then you have all those like taking photos of the different sites, but then it builds a certain narrative, again, not a linear one, but if you spend some time on the website and you like browse, you're starting to connect things, to build stories. So what was the decision to put this material on your website? Was it also related to COVID and this feeling of not being really able to act properly, and then was a way to put them in the world, or was something else?
No, it's not. That started I think 3 years ago, and I wanted to website. Well, I was reading a lot, and my reading was not like I think some scholar told me that the way that I'm doing research is not the way that one should do research, in a way.
That's good. Otherwise, you would be doing something else.
Yeah, because I read whatever I think is interesting, and then I read it, and then I get curious. Often with this kind of document that is underpublished and underread and under-researched. Really, there are not too many books or cultural products you can find about these particular people. One of the problems, as we know in the world right now, is that the poorest people in the world are not directly trying to represent themselves in the culture, and their families often don't have the option to do that either. And then these people often leave from one place to another, so there are not so many traces that you can find. This is like the general reason why this is happening. So whenever I find something that is interesting, there is some dissatisfaction that I have with the way that these people write. So I try to find, this person read this, but where is this book? And I start to look for it. And I see that book, and it describes, let's say, a swimming pool, but I don't know what it looks like, because I only know the swimming pool in New York City, let's say. Then I just want to go and see if there's anything like that swimming pool that is similar. If I cannot find something from the 1905, then I start to look for the 1925 version. Maybe by chance I see something in the background that is interesting. So this is how I started to travel and start to make this website, which is I read the text and I start to quote or to make excerpts of the scenes that, to me, I called it cinematic, but it's creating some kind of space, whether it's about visualization, it could be about making a soundscape, or maybe it's just an incident, maybe a place that I want to visit. Then I went there. So I traveled to I cannot say all, but many of the places that I've been reading about, and it became too much. So I have to somehow organize it. But I didn't want this kind of alphabetical order. It was not about going toward totality. It will just, I haven't updated that website for a while because I was making this film, but it will continue again. And I've been reading other books I didn't update yet. So it is extremely personal, but it's also very expansive. So I thought website was a very good way to organize that. So also other people can share it if they can. But it's a very personal route. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting you're talking about personal, because what I found interesting in your work is the way you're like balancing personal and historical. You mentioned that, you know, like your film and your research are very timely in the sense if we think about all the anti-Asian crimes that happened recently in the States. But as you said, this is not something that happened just recently. It's something that it has its roots, it has its history, it's systematic, it's structural. And, you know, reading more about your research, you're also like pointing out important dates when the Asian immigration stopped, when it was allowed again in 1965, and, you know, what happened in the meantime, who was allowed to come, and so on. And I think we talked yesterday, there are so many also contemporary, like our generation, let's say, writers and poets and artists who are like dealing with this problem now. But you somehow you do have, even in your previous work, whether it's like from the Commandment Heights or even Temple Clay that we are showing, like Korean history is present and somehow your personal story. But again, it's never like a documentary. It's never like a voiceover. I mean, even if there's voiceover, you're not telling your story. There's always this very poetic way of building it, that it's somehow similar to music sometimes, and also music and your work with Michael de Gregorio is very important. So how do you think about those two, like narration, history, and personal, when you are like when you're building your work, when you're building your films?
I thought I understood your question in the beginning, and then and then it went somewhere else.
Oh, well, it's just you know, as I mean, in a way, it's more you answered a lot talking about this film. Hair is a piece of head, but because it's something that in the past you are interested by history. History is something that's fueling, in a way, and then you're also your personal relationship to that. You're aware of the position you're talking from. Mm-hmm. But then you find really this, I call it visual collages in the beginning, but I think they're also related with like how poetry and music are building artworks. So it's more like we can call it artistic strategy, artistic practice, you're like, your
like
way in getting
transposing things, or like a mathematical substitution, like replacement. These things, these kind of ideas are like very common in the way that I think or work, because sometimes it doesn't work if you work with the blocks, but if you change it to the circular balls, it works fine. You know, so if you want to just understand the relationship, you don't necessarily have to work with the blocks. You know, so these kind of strategy has been used in mathematics and science very much, also by musicians and poets. I'm sure other people use it too, but I think. Like in this film, like you asked about the scene, there was an excerpt from another program. It was a language program called Kula IV.
In the Hair is a Piece of Head.
In Hair is a Piece of Head, and it was a Hawaiian language program. And these people who really wanted to teach and who wanted to make people speak Hawaiian language, Hawaiian people speaking Hawaiian language, started to make these episodes, and they're great. I really loved watching them just as a film. And it's just like friends talking. It's like little vignettes, and a lot of times it's friendship and family. And like that scene that I made in that I put in the film is a little clip about auntie coming in to your house and just introducing yourself and saying hello and how cute you are. These things happen a lot, and we remember these moments. It's not something that is strongly related to a theme or your career. It's not always a reference that you bring in when you want to talk about the grave subject. But I think I'm always interested and fascinated by how grave subject, even though it's so related to emotion, emotion is not talked about as much, and in our adult education especially. So, like, how do we talk about, for example, we talk about May 18th massacre, or the war, or the protest, and the death that comes of it, without talking about the people who lost those people. So, because that's where the gravity is really coming from, that the mother who lost a son, and knowing that feeling is making many people being in front of you who have experienced it become a very heavy subject. So when I think about personal, I don't necessarily think about my personal thing, but what I know of everybody's personal relationship, and something that has been important. For example, graves when we talk about graves where people are buried. That to me is a very interesting image because people know what it is. A lot of culture have different protocols as to how to deal with that dead body and the site. And then when you stand next to it, there's an emotion that is coming up to you. But if you know what it is, how do you use that, or how do you depict it? Or maybe depict is too much of a visualization, but how do you treat it to talk about some of the subject that I'm talking about? Because if you don't treat it, the subject, the rhetorics around that subject becomes something that is totally logical and reasonable without the very source of why this becomes important. So that interested me here.
And you know, in the introduction, I said that you have a very unique way of intertwining music, video, storytelling, and sculpture. So we have the opportunity to see Hair is a Piece of Head on our screens. And you know, if there was no COVID, maybe even in this theater, we would premiere it in this theater. But usually how you show your films, there's always something more in the space. There is a drawing, there is a bench, there is a sculpture, or there is an object. You somehow always need to expand the moving image, to expand from the screen. You show the film also in Gwangju. Do you already think how to show it differently? What would be the expanded version of this film?
Yes, in fact, actually, some of the objects that I'm showing at the Temple Clay expansion, because Temple Clay was made in 2012, but the expanded version right now, some of the drawings are old too, but other drawings are not. They're new, and so it's in this thinking space of what the hair is.
It's a gather substitution, what you were talking
earlier.
Yeah.
Yes, so like when I think about installation, I don't think about an installation where everything is becoming to one theme or that one centerpiece that isn't the thing. I think of it as it could be a layer, like the relation between the first floor and the second floor. Two people could be living a totally different autonomous life, but they're related. Sometimes the plans are the same too. So it's one way to understand, again, like this kind of relation between metaphor, the objects that is a metaphor, and in this case, the title is Metaphor for Another Metaphor.
It's the title of the drawing that you're showing in the studio. Yeah,
exactly. So it could be, one could be a metaphor for another metaphor, not even for another object or the central object. And so in some of the fabrication and objects that I'm using, it's the first time I see it. So I have to, it's not about like whether I'm going to be happy or not with it. I look at it and I start to understand, and I start to touch it. I start to see what that is going to begin to
You mean for Temple Clay, the object that...
For the Temple Clay, but for the later on too, because I will look at it. And I'm sure that they will have some kind of meaning, and it did already have meaning for the new rendition of the Hair is a Piece of Head as well. That like architectures like that, before the people come in, it's still an architecture, but when people come in, it starts to have a different kind of stories and meaning. And I think of installational objects like that too. It doesn't have to end with the building of that object or the architecture. It will have a second life in the different generation. So like in this case, it's not about the generation, but the generation of the works that I don't quite understand what it is, but it will have more meanings, more complex meanings afterwards. Yeah.
And the Hair Piece of Head is the first work of your larger series, A Record of Drifting Across the Sea. What are you planning? What are the next steps of this project?
Well, like one of the things that intrigued me by being there was when I see, because right now there's a big talk and investment of talk and many things around identity politics in the world right now. We are living in that world, very interesting. But when it reminds me of the patriots or the independence movement during the colonization area in Korea, what I learned of it, you know. So, and this is one of the reasons why I was interested in that era, that period, is that something that in Korea Korea became independent, there is some kind of, not everything got resolved, but there was a chapter. And then you start to realize, for some people, that didn't happen. So you're in this kind of limbo state where you're not out or in at the same time. So when I went to Hawaii and met with Hawaiians, a lot of them are mixed, naturally, like all of us. A lot of times Hawaiian identity is emphasized. So if you have quarter Chinese, quarter Portuguese something, and then you're Hawaiian, you are Hawaiian. Because only Hawaiian, if you have to have a Hawaiian DNA to call yourself Hawaiian. And there's a lot of pride and privilege and strong meanings in Hawaii to be Hawaiian. For Korean people who are there, if you look at their scholarly research and what they try to represent themselves as, either it is about the purity or of being Korean, or inheriting and having pride in the cultural heritage that was from the past, or celebrating the conformity to the U.S. ideals, or Americanization. So those three things are the three themes that happens with immigration history for the Korean people in Hawaii. So I imagine some of the very famous activists and his son, who is an actor, that's not a very honorable job for an activist in the 1920s to 30s. You want your son to be something else. And he's gay. That's also not something that you want to talk about. What if your daughter was marrying a Filipino or Hawaiian? It's not even the Caucasian person. So it's that kind of, so there's an exclusion and deletion from the minority and a minority group themselves about how they represent themselves. And that story is something that I think I want to do, where...
This is a story you came through, or?
Well, I see it. I see the evidences of it, but it's very difficult to find documents of it, because documents are supported by research funders, as we know, like museums, schools, government. They give fundings for these people to do it, and then there's education because of the professor. There's a whole system of why, as we know, why some things become important. So when
some things are visible and some not, some
yes,
things we'll
these identities
learn about,
and the stories are by these identities that are not welcomed by anybody in your family, then nobody's going to talk about it. This person disappears, and so that story is something that. So it's not a film. Like, I want to start with interviewing these people, because these people I already know some of these people. So I just want to know like how it became about their. Just building some kind of details around their lives, what they look like, where they lived, what they thought, and so forth. That's one thing that that I want to do. Another thing that I'm very interested in is the idea of the tunnels or the roads that gets built, because it follows a movement of the nature, which is a river or the ocean. And so forth, but the humans would sort of like move along with it.
But the immigrants are building tunnels.
Yeah, and then they start to go. I mean, the ocean is a different thing because it's an uncharted place, and then people start to move. But even then, they're following the current. So there is always this kind of movement that is happening before human being, and the human being builds around it. So I like, for example, horses, like people riding horses. That's always an interesting image that I see in these documents, because the people who used to ride horses in one country, when they go to another country, they already have the skill of riding horses, so they do something with that. So there's something that that is being not even imported, that one carries together when one moves to another place. Yeah. So thinking about that and documenting that in my own way is something that is interesting to me. Documenting meaning recreating. Making sure that it becomes a thing, so that that object or idea is not treated as it has never happened before. Yeah.
Well, I think we can stop now and just like looking forward to seeing more of your projects, and inviting everyone who is New York to come to the studio, to the Kravis Studio here at MoMA, to see temper clay. And of course, to watch Hair is a Piece of Head for the next 2 weeks. Thank you so much. Thank you, Song.
Thank you.